Hello everyone, and welcome to this news series on Spotify and YouTube. This is Same Old News with your host, Josh. Episode 1, News in History and Now, an introduction. Hello all, and welcome to Same Old News, the show where we dissect the news both in history and in the present, and try to find some form of link between the two. I am Josh, your host for this series, and in this introductory episode, we're going to be establishing the importance of this topic, and the news in general, and set us up on our road path going forward. So, with that being said, I'm going to start off this series with a story, or it's better to say, a set of stories that I think will set this series off on the right track. Close your eyes. Imagine, it's the 1820s in Guangzhou, China. At the time, the British knew it as Canton, and I shall refer to Guangzhou as Canton from here on out for simplicity. At the time, the port city was the only place for Europeans to trade with China, in a little walled-off area of the city called the factories. At the time, the port city was the only place for Europeans to trade with China, in a little walled-off area of the city called the factories. Westerners were not allowed past that wall. They were in Canton though, for trade, to gain goods that weren't readily available or in as anywhere near a good as quality as in Europe. Porcelain, silk, tea, the list goes on. You name it. The British traders, though, were mainly there on behalf of the East India Company, a charter company that had a monopoly on the China trade by government mandate until 1833. But there were a growing group of private merchants in companies such as Jardine Matheson & Co. and Dent & Co. as well. Even before the East India Company lost their monopoly, they were using private ships to do some of their work for them, mainly opium shipments to the port of Canton. These private traders did some work for the East India Company, but now were starting to make some money of their own with the impending loss of that monopoly in 1833. But they were frustrated in lead up to the start of the First Opium War in 1839. Now, many will know the old story of the Opium Wars. A man named Lin Zexu, who represented the then Daoguang Emperor, shows up to Guangzhou in Guangdong Province, dumps British opium in the Pearl River, the British get mad from losing that profit, and suddenly the First Opium War starts. But from the research of historians, and myself, we find that this isn't exactly the full story. It leaves too much out, obscures too much of the overall picture, especially the lack of information on actors in Canton before 1839. Instead of this flashpoint with Lin and the opium chests, there was a slow growth in hostilities between the British merchants and the Chinese officials in Canton. But where does that growth start? It starts with those merchants I spoke of earlier. Two merchants I want to point out in particular, James Matheson and William Jardine, both of Jardine Matheson & Co. They were also frustrated with the system of trade in Canton. It was the only port in which you could trade with China, and it was all on the terms of the Chinese Hong merchants, collectively known as the Zhou Hong. Hong merchants were essentially government civil servants, and their job was to regulate the trade with outsiders, Westerners, and do all of the deals. They had a full monopoly on the trade. You couldn't trade with anyone else, despite many attempts to do so. This, though, was a problem for private merchants, especially the British, who were starting to take on a more free trade philosophy inspired from the likes of Adam Smith and its burgeoning fusion with evangelicalism. So these merchants chose a place to voice their grievances against the whole trade system in Canton. And they did this on sheets of paper, a newspaper, the Canton Register to be specific. A newspaper run by these merchants, started and funded by Matheson himself in 1827 and edited by William Whiteman Wood, published in Canton for the reading of merchants stationed there. Reports focused on growing understanding of China, but also had shipping reports, trade reports, as well as a running commentary on the state of the trade from the perspective of the Western private traders. That running commentary took the political edge of the interests of private merchants. They were anti-monopoly, not just the East India Company kind that they had seen up until 1833, but also were anti-monopoly in a sense against the Hong merchants. One of the most impactful reports was where the paper published this report entitled Mandarin Merchants on the 15th of February 1830. It focused on the issue of monopoly and corruption in a way that would have been more understandable for its readers both in Canton and in Britain. I will now quote this report. Please do be aware from here on out that any quotes I make are from newspapers of the period of the 1830s in this episode, meaning that the language and the depictions made are very different from what we would expect to be made 200 years since then. So that is just a warning before we continue with any quotes. But also please know that I'm going to change the tone of my voice to get a semblance of the tone that would have been used, or at least how I've interpreted the tone from the writing itself. Quote, "Suppose the whole British trade to the United States of America being limited to 3 or 4 merchants, and these 3 or 4 merchants being the sole medium of intercourse between the English merchants and the governor of the state. Is this a state of things calculated to promote the interests of commerce? The Mandarin merchants ought in all justice to be considered a part of the government of China, and implicated in all acts of that government towards foreigners. The existing Mandarin merchants have betrayed their trust in an alarming degree. They have allowed members of their own body to subduct the public property." End quote. On top of this report, public letters and petitions for the British government to interfere in the trade were published in the pages of this newspaper. But all of this bluster was not contained to just Canton. This sort of sentiment made its way back to Britain, across the country, but it was also expanded upon. The Times, which was known in the 1830s for being the liberal stalwart by the name The Thunderer, based its comments of China off a report brought back to Britain on the main Hong merchant Ho Chua, and called China, quote, "a mass of moral corruption, consisting of atheism, malice, revenge, lying, fraud, and sensuality." Even on a more local scale, reports on China focused on this rhetoric of a corrupt China through the analysis of trade dispute. Sheffield's Independent and Yorkshire and Derbyshire Advertiser wrote in 1832 to open the Chinese trades to stop, quote, "heavy duties and presents being in quotation marks, which barbarian governments exact, and the vexatious restrictions," end quote. Quotes like these are filled to the brim with the language of corruption, presents being the focus of Sheffield's Independent and Yorkshire and Derbyshire Advertiser, but also exactions, the idea of exactions within that system of trade, at least written here. In addition to that language of corruption, it is getting also further racialized, with the discussion of barbarian governments and the policy of trade that those governments would take up. In this case, the Chinese government being likened to barbarians through their specific trade policy, which is being seen in this context as corruption, and that corruption is then further emphasized through racialized language. But this rhetoric from the Canton Register, now in newspapers in Britain, also made its way into the writing of travel writers from Britain discussing China, such as James Matheson himself, George Thomas Staunton, John Francis Davis, and John Barrow. And, as debated by historians such as Song Chuan Chen and Glenn Malencon on the Information War and the arguments of what became known as the Warlike Party, there was a claim that this build-up of rhetoric combined with political pressure on government officials, even as high up as the then Foreign Secretary and future Prime Minister John Henry Temple, Viscount Palmerston, this allowed the declaration of war against China in 1839. Now, what does that story tell us? Well, it tells us a few things. Firstly, it shows the development of xenophobic and anti-Chinese writing that began in the mid to late 1700s across Europe and continues to this very day. Secondly, it tells us about the movement of information going on in this period. There is a global connection here linking China to the United Kingdom. But this movement would have went through British colonies such as India and the Cape Colony, what we now know as South Africa, before making it back to the shores of Britain. Remember, this is the time before the internet and even before technology such as the telegram. For information to move this sort of distance from the port of Canton all the way back to the UK, it would have to do so by sea. But that also helps us to see the long existing global connections even in the late 18th and early 19th century. Globalization is not a recent phenomena of the capitalist world of the 20th century. Finally, and most importantly, it shows the place the press and newspapers hold in shaping opinion on events. Penelope Caulfield, in her recent book on the Georgians, argued that newspaper press was more of a sounding board for public debates, but didn't really hold much power. Now, I disagree with that sentiment slightly. I agree that the press wasn't the only voice in this period, and was in constant conversation with other public sources of information, whether that be the discussions going on in the coffee houses, or even news coming through the form of what you went to watch in the theatre, or the books you were reading, or even when you went to church and the sermon delivered by your local reverend. However, it was one of the very few that had wide public pull and awareness, even with heavy polarization and politicization in that period of the late 18th, early 19th century. And this is still the case today, with the press changing to include radio, television, and even social media. Politics and the news is everywhere, and it's inescapable. Its influence is hard to detach yourself from. After that sort of intro, I think it gets us in the mind frame of answering what this podcast is about. To give some further information about me and what I do, as I've said before, my name is Josh, and I'm a PhD student in history at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, and the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. I'm originally from London in the UK, but with this PhD project, I have in the last month moved out to Australia for most of the next 4 years, and I'm just about settling in. My project is on the right-wing press and British world in the years 1780 to 1830. But what I immediately noticed is how this project can answer a lot of questions, not only of the newspaper press in the past, but also the press in the present day. So this podcast will be exploring both at the same time, with a more specific focus on Britain though, since that's where my knowledge base is. Hence the name for the series, Same Old News. It is to illuminate that this podcast will be exploring not only the press in history, but also in the present. There will also be other episodes from time to time, breaking up the deeper analysis in my regular episodes to focus on stories that are happening right now. I can pick a topic, or you can recommend a topic to me that's going on in the news that you find interesting. I can then do a little roundup of what happened, and then a more analytical breakdown of the news and how different political wings in the press, especially the right wing, since that's where my research focus is, how they are analysing those events. What my PhD project and this podcast aims to do is to focus on the press as a significant factor in shaping our reading of the world and politics, both past and present. But I'm here mainly focusing on the press of the political right wing, in inverted commas. You can't see it, but I'm putting very heavy inverted commas. Because that's one of the things we need to define throughout this series and in my own thesis. What do we even mean when we say things such as right wing? But that's for another episode. So that leaves us at the end of today's rather brief introductory episode. Next time, we will be answering questions about the press in the present day, with some interviews from general people that I just so happen to know, and who took the time to answer my many questions about this topic, and many of them felt they weren't fully qualified to answer those questions, but that's just what I wanted. Until then, thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast wherever it is that you are listening, whether it be Spotify or YouTube. Also, give us a follow on Instagram and Twitter. On Twitter, that's at same_old_news. And for Instagram, it's same_old_news. The username with just one underscore either side must have been taken for Instagram, so we've had to compromise. Please follow those so you can keep up to date on new episode alerts and any other news. But other than that, have an amazing day, and I will see you all soon for the same old news. Thank you very much.